Hey there, you're listening to Paradigm Shift, a podcast about people building the future and pivotal moments in the journey. Today, Zain and I are really excited to speak with Beerud Sheth. Beerud is in the rare breed of founders that's started not one, but two unicorns, Upwork and GupShup. And he's also seen a lot of Silicon Valley history, having started Upwork in '98, just before the dot-com bubble, and having founded GupShup in 2005, just before 3 years before the greater global financial crisis. Today, Upwork is publicly traded. It's valued at $1.5 billion, and GupShup is a unicorn, last valued at over $1 billion as well. And I should also say we are avid fans and users of Upwork. That's how we found our editor for this podcast. So I just want to give a shout out to Richie. He's the best. And finally, I want to thank Rahul Jain from Cloud9 Ventures for the introduction. Welcome, Beerud. Pleased to have you.
Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Ashish and Zain. And thank you for using Upwork. We got to get you using GupShup as well soon. But yeah, I think it's looking forward to this discussion.
So I would love to talk about your background and your immigration story. You arrived in the US at, I think, a really interesting era because it was the start of the internet, like the foundational internet era. I think Mosaic launched like a year after you arrived when you're studying MIT. It was also the start of a lot of like immigration from India. So like there was a lot of new talent and kind of skills coming into the country. So I would love to just kind of, when you reflect back on that time, are there certain things that that were surprising to you?
Well, I'm now dating myself, ain't I? But yeah, I came, from India to the US to start to go to grad school at MIT. I was a graduate of IIT Bombay, which is, sort of among the top schools in India, the top engineering school. And these were, it was a very strange time in the sense that, the Cold War had just ended. Which actually being at a university meant that a lot of the defense funding, right, that the taps were closing now because, hey, we won the Cold War, right? So it was sort of some of the RA and teaching assistantships and so on were declining. So, I'd actually initially gone to the AI lab, and AI itself has had a long story, but that was... I think I ended, they didn't have the research assistantship that I wanted, so I ended up at the media lab, which is a longer story. The internet, just very early traces of it, Mosaic just started, was happening. In fact, people don't even remember, but before Mosaic, there were text-based browsers as well, and there were HTTP, HTML was, HTTP was already there, right? HTML was yet to come and so on. So I think just very, very, we're transitioning from this PC and desktop-centric era, to the web era. We were sort of right in the middle of that. With hindsight, it was a great time to be. And of course, you were seeing all of that, of course, in grad school, but in popular, usage, there was still the world of dial-up, right? AOL, Prodigy, things like that. So it just, you're seeing these things bubbling and nobody could make sense of it and connect it and so on. But it was just very interesting times. Yeah.
You mentioned you're doing research at the Media Lab. What were you working on?
So I was focused on developing what we call autonomous agents for news filtering, right? Basically, software that can create a personalized news agent for you. Right, it would deliver things, and I think we've had many versions of it. In fact, maybe the best example is this company called Toutiao in China, which is a part of ByteDance. Right, they sort of used AI-based personalization that's so compelling. I mean, it's sort of a killer app, right? Very popular and so on. But yeah, this was in the sort of early mid '90s, so it was a while ago. You didn't have nearly the hardware then that you do now. Even, you didn't have deep learning and so on, which is all very, very recent now and so on. So, it was much earlier versions of the technology, but certainly, you're always peeking into the future, far ahead. Yeah.
Sounds a lot like TikTok for news. But but before like machine learning and neural networks. And so, what were the techniques back then? Like, what did AI mean in 1994?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was, expert systems. You had genetic algorithms, which was something I used for my thesis. Neural nets, of course, existed. They were just, much smaller and therefore couldn't do that much. And in fact, so a lot of the debate, a lot of AI hype cycle is sort of ended up focusing on the wrong thing, right? It's not like the technology or the algorithms have changed. It's just that there's now so much hardware and parameters. And when you actually do, take it, put it all together, they can do amazing things, as we know. But yeah, I think at that time it was just a lot simpler, a lot more explicit hands-on hacking as opposed to, you just sit back and let AI do the work. Yeah.
Did you know at that time that you wanted to start a software company?
In a sense, the thought process evolved, right? So firstly, coming from India as an immigrant with very little, money in your pocket, just enough for the flight and so on, right? So I think you kind of, you're forced to figure out very quickly what you're going to do, right? You can't, there's no safety net. Really being in grad school in the PhD program, you have a couple of options. Either you're going to stay in academia, in which case you sort of do your PhD and postdoc and do other things, right? And become a professor somewhere. I was pretty clear that that was not the path for me. So in fact, I kind of dropped out of the PhD program after 2.5 years. I did my thesis for my master's. And, I was very clear I wanted to be on the business side of things, have real world impact, right? Not just come up with ideas or theories and then have somebody else implement it. But that idea, that also evolved. Initially I actually, ended up taking a job on Wall Street, believe it or not, which was also getting very technical. They were hiring math and CS majors and so on. So, but meanwhile, the internet was happening, Mosaic became Netscape, which sort of then went public, and Amazon, and a lot of these things were happening. And, you get this feeling saying, like, what am I doing, right? Yes, there's a good salary and a good job and so on, but meanwhile, something massive is happening in the world. And at some point when I look back and, my grandkids ask me, like, what were you doing when the internet was being born? I didn't want to be like a bystander or something like that, right? So I think it sort of, it just emerged and evolved in terms of saying, okay, there are these opportunities, and I have this, ability and experience and technical ability, and you can connect the dots, and a lot of it, you kind of have to think a few steps into the future, saying, what's the world going to look like? And nobody was doing it. So, you say, okay, why not, right? So I think the only thing, a lot of people see the future and have the ability, but the last bit is just taking the risk. And, I think it was, I don't know if there's a simple formula. You really have to just go and do it. And it's very risky, right? Sometimes when you're blessed with an exceptional academic record and a great sort of career job, if you will, it's even harder to give it up, right? Because it's sort of so attractive, and then you're taking an extreme risk. It's a lot easier when you have nothing to lose and you go do it, maybe, arguably. But here it was a difficult choice. But I was like, look, what's the worst that can happen? I can always get back the same job again, and so on.
In addition to that, giving up something that's really good, you were in a good place. A lot of immigrants also struggle with H-1B and visa kinds of issues, right? How did you navigate those? And the reason I'm asking is I've got friends who would probably be great entrepreneurs, but they're just sort of like, blocked because of a visa issue, and they're waiting for their green card or something like that. So how did you kind of navigate that back in the day?
That's a great question. Nobody's asked that before. I think I guess I hacked it. Nothing illegal, right? It was all legal, just for the record. But absolutely, I think usually for immigrants coming in here, you feel, because the way the immigration system works, your visa is tied to your employer, and therefore you can't take that kind of risk, start a company and so on. And I knew that as well, getting out of grad school. So what I did actually was I applied for sort of green card in what's called the national interest category. right? And that's a category where, typically it's used by, I don't know, it could be athletes, Olympic medals who want to immigrate to the US, they've created a special category. Or if you're exceptionally good academic track record and, you do demonstrate your track record, you get a bunch of recommendations. It's almost like college applications, right? But much more intense. It takes a lot of work and effort. And of course, there's no certainty that you'd get it. But I applied through that category, and that's an accelerated process, right? So that happened much faster, which gave me exactly the freedom to be able to do this. And I think honestly, people, even in the government, they talk a lot about this immigration debate and leaving aside, some of the complexities of it. There's certainly like a small subset that I think everybody can universally agree that, the entrepreneur visa, and I think now there are newer visa categories and so on, it's become easier. But there's no question that, we as a country, it benefits the US to bring in entrepreneurs, the job creation, this and that. The upside versus the downside is just so positively skewed that, I think at least that part of it, I think they should take care of it. Yeah. So this was now back in the mid 90s. I don't think they had any, startup and entrepreneurship was not yet as big a thing as it is now, which is well understood, right? So that was the way I did it. Yeah.
You'll be pleased to hear that that exact approach still works even today. There's a number of YC entrepreneurs I know who've applied for like an exceptional person kind of visa, which is how I think of it, which is I think what you did too. And it still works. So fortunately, like that still is something people can do.
Yeah. And at this point now, there's a very well-established documented record where you look at the number of startups being started by immigrants and, the number of jobs, job creation and economic wealth creation, right? That it's done for the economy is just insane. And I think, it's nothing, I think what happens is just that immigrant work ethic is just different, right? That combination of work ethic plus insecurity, right? Financial insecurity plus fear. It just driving motivation, right? The second generation, that circumstance is missing. Now, of course, they can find, the drive, an internal drive in a different way. But with immigrants, it just, you're just conditioned to it. It's such an existential thought process. It's hard to even relate when I think back to my younger self, right? I think it's sort of like, no price is too high, no challenge is too hard. You just have to do it, whatever it takes. You're going to, sort of run through walls if needed to achieve what you have to do. And then sometimes, that's what you need for startups to succeed. So I think that tends to be highly correlated sometimes, So yeah, we as a country, we should certainly take advantage of it. Yeah.
Totally. So you spent some time on Wall Street, then you were obviously driven to start a company, and your first company was Elance, which would later merge with Upwork, merge with Odesk to form Upwork. But I would love to hear about the founding story of Elance. Like, what was the the founding insight of that, and how did you get started from the idea into actually building a product?
I think. Yeah, so literally me and my co-founder, we were, I was still on Wall Street. I was working at Merrill Lynch. I think he was at another investment firm. And, in the evenings, we'd just sort of hang out and brainstorm and so on. And that happened over several months. But at least in my mind, I think it was really three of my formative influences that kind of came together and so on, right? The first, having immigrated from India, I clearly knew that there are lots and lots of smart, talented people all over the world, just like, of course, in the US as well. But if you're sitting in New York and you see a lot of these businesses saying we don't have enough talent or resources and so on, I'm like, well, wait a minute, there's a whole world of that out there. The second is, having done my studies in computer science and tech and seeing the internet as it was being born, the ability to connect people and so on, which is kind of, obvious now in hindsight, but at that time, people, you sort of, they couldn't extrapolate a lot of that. It wasn't common knowledge. So you could see the power of that to bring, to build connections around the world, use technology and in a certain way. You have to remember this is before Dropbox and before Skype and before, any cloud services and things like that, right? So anyway, that was the second part. And then the third part is my Wall Street experience sort of helped me understand that you could create a marketplace for anything. I mean, not just, usually when people think about markets, they think about stock markets or treasuries, which are highly liquid, instruments, but you could have even illiquid instruments like, like derivatives and so on. So the point is, if you take these three ideas, I mean, you end up with a global services marketplace, right? It's global. People can sign up from anywhere. It's a marketplace that connects buyers and sellers in a structured format. And it's a marketplace where you can bid and offer, right? You post a project, somebody bids for it, there's price, there's competition that has a self-regulating dynamic to it. And then we added reputation and so on. Maybe the only other thing was, when we were getting started, now this was, in the 98 timeframe. By then, the context is, Netscape had happened, Yahoo had already happened, Amazon, eBay, right? So basically we said, look, content, I mean, there's a lot of early first movers, commerce, and all of that commerce was focused on goods. So we said the commerce of services, which could be an even bigger opportunity, right, is where we could be the first mover sort of thing. So I think, those were some of the ideas that came together to form Elance.
Well, I'd be really curious to hear what the first version of it looked like. And the reason I'm asking is, Elance was founded in 1998. I believe Google was founded in 1998, right? The typical company goes public in about 10 years, maybe 12 years. Back then, it might have looked like 5 to 7 years. You guys didn't go public for, I think, 20 years, right? 2018 right. is when you went public, and it was like a long road. So would love to hear what those early days looked like. What was the V1 of the product? And what were some key inflection points as you built that business over 2 decades?
Sure. I think, literally the first word, I mean, we sort of put together we raised a small round of seed funding and set up a website where people could do it. But, with the marketplace, it's not just about the technology, it's about the buyers and sellers, right? You got to have people to do it, right? So, what we did, and again, a lot of it is just, classic entrepreneurial hacking, if you will, right? So you sort of literally found a handful of businesses, 5 or 6 local businesses that had some things that they wanted to do. Some of them were even just friendly favors, if you will. And then on the who could post projects, and then on the other side, right? I mean, who's going to really sit in? This is at the birth of online freelancing. I mean, there's nobody out there just sitting there trying to look for work of this kind. So we actually connected back to my alma mater, IIT, right? I sort of found a bunch of students who were in their summer internship at that time and said, hey, here's a site, there's a bunch of projects listed here, you can bid for them and you can get paid. And, for them, they're supposed to be doing some internship, but it wasn't super engaging. Meanwhile, here, just by doing some quick work, they could get a few $100s, which is a ton of pocket money sitting in Mumbai in the mid 90s, late 90s. So, they jumped on it and they were all over it and they really liked it. And, in a way, they did some good work. And of course, we had to refine a lot of things around reputation and, managing and delivery. And, how do you communicate? How do you deliver, time zone difference? I mean, there's all kinds of issues that we had to work with, right? I mean, I was preaching remote work in the late 90s, right? Where people, the general thing would be to say, oh, what if, can I trust somebody who I don't see face to face? Do they speak English? Are they professional? What if they run away with my money? Sort of things like that. And, it took like 2 decades and a pandemic for remote work to become conventional wisdom. So I don't know, I was blessed or cursed with being way ahead of our time. But I think, there was a lot of little things that had to fall into place. And of course, a lot of technology as well, for for a shared workspace, payments, how do you handle payments in different countries, even just process like milestones and deliverables and having a clear spec up front. Otherwise, you have too many iterations, things like that. So I think it took a lot of work in the early days. We got about a year later, we got funded by Kleiner Perkins. So that's when we moved out west, right? The whole company, about 22 of us, lock, stock, and barrel, including pets and boats. They moved out west, and so that was one big inflection point. Really helped us scale, and in the Valley scheme of things, I think that was fantastic. In fact, maybe a year later, again, we raised another sort of $50 million round. And fortunately, that was just before sort of the dot-com bubble burst, right? The whole stock crisis and so on. So that was another, sort of the agony and ecstasy of this whole thing, right? So maybe another inflection point was we, in hindsight, wasn't a great idea, but we pivoted from what was a B2C-like model into a B2B model. We ended up creating from the services marketplace, we created some procurement software for large enterprises who wanted to buy services, right? And ultimately, about 6 or 7 years later, we sort of sold out. We built that up, scaled it to some level, and then actually sold it off and refocused on the original thing, right? Now, with hindsight, which is 2020, it would have been a lot simpler to just stay focused on what we were doing and just continue, scaling it up, right? So obviously, but yeah, I think those were the, twists and turns. And at some point now, I left my operating role around 2005, and I started when we started GupShup. But I think, but I was still on the board. The merger with Odesk happened in 2014, and then the IPO happened in 2018, right? So. I think it was a long journey, lots of twists and turns, a lot of hard work, perseverance, grit, a couple of financial crises along the way as well, one merger, and then finally, an IPO. And even the public markets have been crazy if you think about it the last 3-4 years. So the stock itself has been, 4 times where it is right now. But that's okay. The good thing is with hindsight, this is still a company for the ages. This is how, it's sort of defining remote work in a way, at least the freelance version of it. And I think it'll continue to scale, as we adopt this more and more.
It seems to me like, first of all, raising from Kleiner back in the day was sort of like the gold standard, right? That was like as blue chip as you could get. So you must have had some amazing traction or revenue or something of that sort, right? Like, what did that early revenue look like? And I'm curious because this is a world where Stripe didn't exist. I'm assuming people were not very comfortable putting a credit card in. And so what was that early monetization like? And I'm just kind of curious, why is it that Upwork, Elance, Odesk have been sort of these slow compounding companies in a sense? I don't know if that's fair. It has compounded. It is a marketplace. It's a great business, but it's been a bit of a slower sort of growth in market share than what we've seen in some of the more explosive marketplaces. And so what are just some of your reflections on that, or just thoughts on why that's been the case and how maybe things might have been different if certain decisions might have been different?
In the early days, revenues, growth, adoption, traction was trending quite well. It was increasing, and in fact, with the dot-com bust, we also saw that it was counter-cyclical, right? Because even when people want to save money, they would use it more, right? Unlike many other products that they would want to cut, but here they would rely even more on freelancers. I think perhaps the one sort of weakness of the model as the way it was set up, and I think it's probably still is I'm not actively involved with the company anymore, haven't been for many years, right? So this is a very outside-in perspective at this point, but I can certainly talk to my time. there, which was that, one of the Elance and Upwork, they add far more economic value to the ecosystem than they capture. What I mean by that is, usually it introduces a buyer and seller. The first one or two transactions happen there, but oftentimes people go offline, right? And they engage. And, you mentioned your producer. Maybe you met them on Upwork, but I don't know if they continue to work, if you continue to work with them.
We still pay through Upwork. But I get what you're saying. It's very easy to go offline, right? And save the 10% fee or whatever the fee is. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even malicious, right? Sometimes it's just convenient, or maybe it's an unspecified job that they are sort of ongoing, whatever be the reason. And I think it was designed as a somewhat more open system, and I think that doesn't fully capture and monetize its value. And the moment you don't do that, right, you don't have enough surplus cash to sort of invest in the business at every stage of growth, right? No matter how big or small you are, right? By comparison, when you think about sort of the highest growth companies, they actually monetize extremely well, and then they take that surplus monetization and sort of reinvest it back in the business, right? I've seen other variations of the Upwork model, right, more recently, where it's a little bit more buttoned down, because there are contracts and there's mechanisms which forces all the billing to happen there, right? So, for example, if somebody has, let's say,
I think Coptal does that, right? They're very restrictive. They have fees for going off market. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There are a few mechanisms, and they track and they monitor every part of it. A lot of the tools have gotten better as well, right? Because they say the billing and the timing and all of that is tied into the core of the system and so on, right? And when you do that, I mean, I've seen companies that have, I don't know, 1/10 the GMV or the GMS, gross merchandise or gross services sales, I think they call it, gross service volume, GSV, let's say, sorry. So the GSV, with 1/10 of the services volume, they have, as much the monetization, right? And I think it's sort of insane. So clearly, I mean, that's the only sort of big thing that jumps out to me, right? So, I think it can't just be a great idea. You have to be monetizing it as well. And by the way, if you look at the topical story, Twitter, I mean, that's part of the same problem, right? It adds a ton of value to the ecosystem, but perhaps doesn't monetize nearly as much, and that's why it's been in all of these struggles as it has. So, yeah, that's the only thing I can think about. Everything else, I mean, the rest is features that can be fixed or improved, or, payments and, cloud storage and communications and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Like, if you look at some of the other marketplaces that are more structured, like Uber, DoorDash, like the service is commoditized, and the service also like runs on the rails of the app. Like, there's no way to go off network, right, on Uber and DoorDash. So, obviously it's a very different market and different business, but in that regard, they're structurally capturing or set up to structurally capture more of the value.
Exactly. And I think in those cases, even circumstantially, I mean, it's sort of, you don't know if that driver is available at that time in that neighborhood, right? So it's really hard. I mean, very rarely somebody going to say, okay, you can drive me every day, right? And I'll pay you offline. I mean, that doesn't happen very often. But on Upwork, it's the opposite, right? Sometimes you find somebody, but then say, hey, just work with me on a recurring basis. And then a lot of it goes offline, and it doesn't capture, so I think there are ways to address it. Perhaps the company can do and should do better. Like I said, I'm not actively there anymore, so I should mention that disclaimer.
It seems a little bit like the broader the marketplace, like the less like deep you can go in the workflows, and so the less you can monetize. Whereas like TopTail goes so deep in their software workflows. So I guess just one interesting question, and then maybe we should move on to the next topic is, is there one category of like Upwork style work or remote work, even if it's like not an Upwork category, where you think there's a lot of opportunity for like a deep workflow software that can be like a marketplace that captures a lot more of the value?
Oh, yeah. And I think there's quite a few businesses doing it. I mean, you can imagine, right, having founded Elance and Upwork, I think I get through LinkedIn, probably a business idea every other week saying, oh, we are doing the Elance of that and the Upwork of this, right? So I've seen, I don't know, hundreds of variations of it. But certainly software development is one category that clearly you can go deeper into. But I know of other companies that have gone deeper into, let's say, transcription services or marketing services. I think even somebody who's doing logos alone, for example. I think some of, and then there's newer technology, could be app development, could be other things, specialized versions of it. But generally those used to be the top 2-3 categories for us, right? Anything web, software, and tech related was one category. The other was marketing, design, writing, translation, right? All of those was another big category. I mean, those are the two big areas. And then there's sort of a longer tail, yeah.
Amazing.
People talk about the unbundling of Craigslist. I feel like there's a bit of an unbundling of Upwork happening too, and there's so much value creation.
I would love to transition to GupShup. There's just so much there to talk about. It's such an interesting business. Like it operates in multiple countries. The story is fascinating. I remember using it when I think it was a B2C company like 10 years ago, or the product was more B2C oriented. So, but maybe we'll start with today and then we can kind of go with the history of it. Can you describe like what GupShup is today as a business, what it does, the scale that it operates at, and the long-term vision?
Sure. Well, firstly, for your listeners who may not be familiar, the word GupShup itself means chit chat, right, in Hindi. And as the name implies, we focus on conversations, right? We are a conversational engagement platform for businesses to engage their consumers across the whole life cycle. So use cases such as marketing, commerce, and support, right, can all be done through messaging. So the end user experience is that they can chat with a business just as easily as chatting with a friend or family member, right? And through those conversations, I mean, imagine if you're chatting with an airline or a hotel or an e-commerce service or a bank, right? And through those chat conversations, it could be, okay, what's my balance? I want to book my ticket. I want to cancel. I want to upgrade. All of that just happens through a chat experience, right? And then one might ask, well, why do it through chat itself, right? Don't we have perfectly good websites and mobile apps? And again, for that, it's an important point to remember where most of your American listeners, may experience internet in a very different way than emerging markets do, right? I think in the US, when the internet happened in the mid-90s, right, the early stories we were talking about, we were just shifting from it was still sort of a desktop, laptop-centric era, right? The big screen interface and websites got popular, and every business, every brand had to build a website, and we know there are millions of them, right? And by the time smartphones came around, it was just an extension to this whole rich web ecosystem that existed. But emerging markets sort of, skipped that first part and leapfrogged to smartphones. And on smartphones, they all use messaging, right? Everybody is on WhatsApp or could be WeChat or Line or whatever it is, depending on the country you're in. And they don't have that sort of rich web experience anywhere nearly as much. Those habits never got formed, right? So now when businesses and brands are building a digital presence or want to build a digital presence, instead of building websites and apps, they're building these conversational experiences, right? Right inside WhatsApp, because that's where the users are, right? So once they do that, then those consumers are like, this is fantastic, right? I'm already spending, all my time inside WhatsApp, and now I can do so much more. And if you're familiar with China, if you've ever traveled there, right, WeChat is this super app that is, not just a messaging app to chat with your friends, but you can book, buy, shop, and pay for virtually anything, right? I mean, at a restaurant or with a vending machine or a billboard. I mean, it's all, you interact through the messaging app, make payments, orders, bookings, things like that. So it's a very different world that I think a lot of people don't realize. But the emerging markets is these mobile-first, messaging-centric ecosystems are very different. So what happens is when they want to enable these rich experiences, so in the US, typically you'll get a text message with a hyperlink. You go to the website, your credentials are already there, and you go do your transaction. But in the emerging markets, there is no website to click through to, right? Or people don't do that. That habit's not there. So instead, the messaging itself is very rich. So anyway, so that's the big context, right? So if that's happening, then what GupShup does is we have the platform that helps millions of businesses, as millions of businesses do that, we're going to help, we are the platform that enables them to build these conversational experiences. We have, like 50,000 customers. We have like 250 million in revenues. We're growing very rapidly. We're profitable. And really it just, it's literally the birth of another internet, emerging market style. And the whole internet, as you know it, is going to get, I think, repurposed or reformatted for a conversational front end in the emerging market. So, sorry for that long-winded explanation, but I think that context was important. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a massive business. Like you're operating at incredible scale. I'm kind of curious. So what percent of the business is like based in India versus like not in India? And then within that, it's just fascinating. I would love to talk more about the India piece and like the levers driving that, because yeah, typically, well, maybe I'll pause there and we can go more into India, but I would just love like high level, what's the split?
Yeah, so today it's about 80% India, and a lot of that's because, for a variety of legacy reasons, our engineering team is primarily there, and the initial base of customers was all there. So it used to be a lot higher, but the international portion, meaning other countries outside India, is growing a lot faster now. We think hopefully it'll become half and half, India and elsewhere. But among the emerging markets, if you think about it, I mean, India really, is huge by comparison to any other part. And China is sort of a different world into itself, right? So if you think about emerging markets ex-China, really India is the biggest market anyway. And then you have LATAM, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, and so on. But yeah, I think, and the dynamics there are just exactly what I said, right? It's mobile first, it's messaging centric. Everybody and their brother is on WhatsApp. So the more you can do it, through that. And WhatsApp, by the way, has done an amazing job of enabling a lot of the, foundational features. So again, most people who use messaging in the US don't realize, when you think about messaging, you're like, oh, I just sent a text message, and maybe you can add an emoji or something, right? But when you think about WhatsApp and some of the rich business messaging features they've enabled, you can have, like quick replies with buttons, you can have lists, you can have literally the shopping catalog, you can have a payment mechanism. So there are different messaging formats that allow for these rich experiences. So it feels very natural, right? I mean, it's just very simple and intuitive. And if you haven't used it, it feels sort of a little odd. But for those users, it's sort of as natural as it can be.
I mean, GupShup is like an incredibly robust platform. Like the capabilities are like extremely deep and rich. In terms of like where you end up delivering most of your messages, is a lot of it on like SMS? Is a lot of it on into WhatsApp? Like what does that look like on like the delivery side of things?
Yeah, so I think traditionally it used to be all SMS, because that was the only way to reach billions of mobile devices, right? Mobile phones. So for the last 10, 12 years, it's all been on SMS and so on. WhatsApp emerged about 2 or 3 years ago, right? 2018, so maybe 4 years ago, where they opened up business messaging APIs and started offering these features, right? So there's this, but like I said, WhatsApp is much richer capabilities, right? You can do things on WhatsApp that you just could not on SMS, right? So all these new use cases that I'm talking about, marketing and commerce and support, is all on WhatsApp. And that, it's grown from like 3-4 years ago, it was 0, but it's now about 40% of our revenues is just from these sort of newer or richer messaging channels, right? Maybe one simple analogy I'll give you is the way, to think about what's happening here is think about these chatbots or conversational experiences as the new website, and think of the messaging app as the new browser, right? And when you think of it that way, then really, just like out here, there are maybe a Shopify or a WordPress, they help businesses set up rich websites. Out there, GupShup is the platform that helps businesses set up these rich conversational experiences.
And are these businesses like developers or are they like brands or both?
It's a whole spectrum, right? It's almost like asking, who builds a website here, right? I mean, of course, so there's large enterprises, but even there, if they're traditional enterprises, then sometimes they're used to a full service thing, so they'll ask us to help them build it. But if you have a lot of these new digital native companies, right, that are chock full of developers, and they're like, okay, just give us the API, we're good with it, we'll build it up. And then when you get to mid-market or even small businesses, again, right, it depends. I mean, it could be a restaurant owner or the corner grocery store where they're like, look, just do it for me. I have no technical ability or time. And then you'll have these small startups that, again, very tech savvy and want to just tinker with stuff. So therefore, we provide a spectrum of capabilities. There is, of course, the no code or the low code version of it. And then, of course, there's the technical APIs that they can, have a go at and do whatever they want, right? So we provide, and then there's also a small solutions team, right, that can sort of do the customizations, the integrations, and so on. It varies. I mean, we don't want to, we want to be a product and a platform, right? But the solutions thing just helps accelerate adoption, and we can simplify it, right? And anyway, we use it as a learning mechanism. So once we see these patterns, recurring patterns, and we'll templatize it, productize it, so that the next 100 customers, don't need to do it custom. Maybe the first one or two does.
I'm trying to find like a analogy for our US audience for how they can kind of like visualize it. Is it fair to say that you're kind of like a Twilio layer for SMS, WhatsApp, plus a bunch of workflows for different industries and use cases in one kind of product and company? Is that fair or not really?
Well, yeah, partially. I mean, exactly. I think the way to think about it is there's like 2 or 3 layers to the company, and these layers don't come together in the US, but they certainly do in the emerging markets, right? So, typically out here, firstly, there's a pre-existing layer of all the rich workflows and business use cases. That's all on the website, right? And maybe they use WordPress or other tools, right? That's one set of capabilities. And then the Twilio layer is messaging, which is at least in the US, is used merely for notifications, right? You notify the user saying, hey, you need to do something, and click through and go to the website. And the two are kind of very different businesses, right? I mean, maybe let's say Shopify does all the workflows and use cases, and then Twilio does the notifications. Yeah, when you think about GupShup, you kind of have to take both of it, right? Because one is sitting on top of the other, right? So the base layer, maybe like Twilio, right? But on top of it, all the rich web business workflows and use cases are built on top of messaging. And the reason why they're linked, like I explained earlier, is, it's a very unique ecosystem. So yeah, in that sense, right, I think the workflows and the business processes and the user experiences are an increasingly bigger part of the business, because some of these capabilities, it used to be very simple notifications too, maybe 3-5 years ago, but now it's just becoming so advanced and so complex. It's literally a new version of the internet, right? A new variant coming through that out here it doesn't make sense to do it here. Though even here in the US, you're seeing it in bits and pieces. Instagram, for example, is enabling, you can do some business APIs through that. I think Google Business Messaging is also coming up. There's like click to chat ads. It's sort of trickling in some formats, right? So it's not going to, we don't need to replace the web because, of course, it's sort of so well established with, all kinds of infra. But I think there are some areas where still, even in the US, messaging will play a big role.
Yeah, I mean, one other example is United. Like, their customer service is on iMessage, and there's polling options. Like, there's features built into iMessage, which is pretty interesting. It is almost like you guys are building more into the application layer and kind of eating into that, because a lot of the workflows and UX and applications live in messaging and emerging markets. So that brings up a question of like value capture. How do you all think about, building out products that complement your existing, your platform to build new new features and new revenue streams? Because I would imagine like you have these massive customers already using you for messaging and interaction, communication. It would be, possible to offer them other things like CRM or marketing. So how are you all thinking about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as we move further up the product stack and the value stack, I think those opportunities open up, right? I think the closer you are to the base layer, to the messaging layer, then, it tends to be per message or per session based pricing, which is all consumption based, right? So, which is also great because as they grow, the volumes keep growing, and, we operate in parts of the world that are still growing very, very fast, unlike in spite the market, the stock market volatility and so on. So that's the base layer, right? But the further up you go, like in marketing, typically, people pay on a per user, per active user kind of models, right? CRM tools, like you said. Commerce tends to be per transaction fee, right? Some sort of, ratio of that. And then when you go to customer support, oftentimes it's per agent, though even that is sort of losing meaning because as you automate more, right, how many agents are there? So, but absolutely right. I think it's a function of the more value we add, the more comfortable businesses would be to do value-based pricing, right? And of course, we might take a little more risk, but there could also be more upside if we can align ourselves with what our customers need. Right, then because even in marketing campaigns, right, you can, if there's some performance-based pricing, then actually it's win-win for everybody, right? So I think, these are natural growth opportunities for us as we take it from here.
I have a question about how you've sort of like approached scaling the business. You founded GupShup in 2005, I believe. So it's been around a long time. It's not a new company, but messaging hasn't really blown up, I think, since about, let's say, like 5 or 10 years. Even the Indian market hasn't really like blown up or been as hot until fairly recently. And so how have you approached sort of like, how did you approach those first 5 or 10 years of the company? Was your mindset, hey, let's get this thing to be like a profitable and fast growing company? Or were you sort of like executing on like the traditional VC playbook? Like, how have you thought about that? And how do you think about like the next 5 or 10 years all the way up through like a liquidity event or like an IPO, which I assume you now have pressure to get to, given you've raised a lot of money. So I just curious to hear sort of like your mindset in the early days and today and how that sort of changed and what your goals are.
I think, I guess one of the hardest life lessons as an entrepreneur has been you kind of, you focus on the things you control and you sort of accept the things you can't, that you don't control, and kind of deal with that, right? So for example, like you said, messaging wasn't fast growing, or rather it was all based on SMS. And with SMS, there's limited headroom to add value, right? Because the protocol itself is very limited. And we were sort of chafing at the limits of that mechanism, but there wasn't anything we could do. We tried creating a messaging app, but it's very expensive to drive adoption. Then Facebook Messenger also had launched some APIs, but that never really took off with chatbots and so on, right? So you kind of have to wait for the ecosystem to get there, right? It's not like sometimes you can't magically create these things. It's a bit like the surfer, who's all trained and ready to show off her skills, but until the big wave comes, I mean, where are you going to perform, right? So you kind of have to, is a little bit, and that's actually very challenging, right? Because the whole entrepreneurial energy, I mean, you're so impatient and you're eager to do it and so on. So yeah, but we waited for that, and we were in discussions, we knew or we anticipated WhatsApp would do it, and that in particular would take off because that's in a very fertile territory, right? Unlike Facebook Messenger, which is more US-centric, WhatsApp has worked very well. So those phases where you're in the middle can be really challenging and hard. And yeah, right, for about 10 years now, we raised some early funding. Maybe the last round, let's say in 2011, was about a $10 million round. But since then, for about 10 years, we had no funding, which means, we had to become a profitable company, which therefore means you can't overinvest, so you have to live within your means and so on. But luckily, one was WhatsApp happened. There were some other new products that we had launched. We were the first to move to it. Then COVID accelerated a lot of digital adoption as well, right? And that's when we saw a lot of growth. And then we did the big funding round, which then we invested into some acquisitions and a lot of hiring as well, which has also continued to accelerate the business and so on, right? So it's kind of, yeah. So now we're certainly, in a very gone from first gear to fourth gear, if you will, right? In terms of blitz scaling and hyper growth, we've gone from 200 people a year and a half ago to 1,500 people now, right? So it's just intense. So yeah, I think as an entrepreneur, you have to go with the flow. You got to play the cards that you're dealt with. Now, of course, you try to change the game in your favor. You try to expand the market, do all of those things. But when you can't, or in spite of your efforts, if it's not happening, I mean, you just have to wait or see, what the best course of action there is. Yeah.
That's incredible. What an amazing journey. Like you were, forced to be disciplined and build, sustainable business, and were able to ride these like massive waves. We didn't talk about geo or the rise of like Android and mobile in India, but you had massive tailwinds that have helped in the last few years. We have a couple of questions that we ask every guest at the end of the show. We'd love to jump into those. The first is around feedback. What's the most challenging or difficult feedback you've received, and how have you processed it moving forward?
I don't know if you just mean personal feedback, but the harshest feedback for any entrepreneur is when the market or your customers tell you that they don't want what it is you've spent, years, you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into building something, and they don't want it or not enough or don't want to pay for it, right? And I think I don't know if that counts, right? But if I were to use that, then the pivots that you then have to execute, right? Which is, I mean, that's the hardest thing to deal with. And it's even harder to deal with as a group, right? Because it's one thing to say, okay, take some personal feedback and fine, I can try to change my behavior. But now you're trying to change a group behavior with everybody having, second guessing and having different opinions. And there's a lot of insecurities and things that come into play. So I think those have been among the hardest to deal with. The simpler version is just personal feedback in terms of, growing, and a lot of it is just, I think the good thing about entrepreneurship is the more you do it, the more you can anticipate, so the better you get at it. You don't get hassled and frazzled and so on. But yeah, I mean, you need to be really, the simple answer is you need to be really intellectually honest, willing to observe, learn, both at a personal level, but even more so as an organization, to have this humble and hungry kind of approach, right? Okay, if somebody has complaints, well, let me know, right? And I'll often get emails on LinkedIn or something saying, oh, we had this bad experience, or can you improve this and that? And I'm always eager to engage with those kind of things. So, I seek out that feedback and try to, adjust, course correct, or pivot as needed. Yeah.
That's great. Well, you're the first guest to frame, pull from the market as feedback, but I love it. It's totally feedback. Second question is around superpowers. Everyone has a set of things that they do that feels like play to them, but work to others. And, things that they're eerily good at. Are there things that you've learned about yourself that you're just like naturally gifted at that you like to lean on day to day?
Well, like the whole story explained, the one thing I've become good at, and it wasn't by design, more by accident, is just like grit, right? Perseverance, just hanging in there. Because both my journeys, right? The first one was 20 years to an IPO. Now, I wasn't there all that time, but the company itself was 20 years to an IPO. And this one is 17 and counting, and hopefully, will be ahead of the previous record. But it takes just an enormous amount of, patience, grit, perseverance, and so on. So I say that would be one. Maybe a couple of others, if I throw in, is just being adaptive, looking beyond the horizon and adjusting to the markets, or even just being able to deal with a wide variety of personalities. And I've met many colorful personalities, in sort of both my companies and so on, right? So anyway, yeah, I think those are things that I really end up relying on as I go through this journey.
And the last one's around reading. Is there anything that you've been reading recently that has stuck with you that you would recommend to others?
A couple of things. One is an old book that I'm rereading because of our current context, is just blitz scaling. Just very timely. Well, timely for us, right? It may or may not be helpful to others depending on their context. The other, I don't know if I counted literally reading a specific book, but I think I like to read about developments and so on. So I've just been spending a lot of time reading and tinkering with generative AI. It seems to be the big buzzword right now. But I think it has huge implications for what we do and so on, right? So I think that's another just refreshing. I guess the last is, I love biographies, partly, maybe not just biographies, but even just the history of Silicon Valley. And, when you look at something a priori, right, or before the fact rather than after the fact, like why did people make those decisions or how did they deal with it? I mean, to me, there's numerous books of those kinds, but yeah, that's what I like to read.
Amazing. Well, Beerud, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate you sharing your story. We're rooting for you with GupShup. I think it sounds like just a really interesting and business, and I think it's got a bright future. And thanks again for building Upwork. We appreciate it. We appreciate using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. It was great GupShupping with you, chatting with you.